One single letter changed the course of an entire civilization forever. When a Roman emperor penned those fateful words in 410 CE, he had no idea he was about to abandon millions of people to an uncertain fate. Britain, a land that had known Roman protection for nearly 400 years, was suddenly told to defend itself. No more legions, no more imperial support, just survive if you can. Emperor Honorius didn't just write a letter Minos, he signed Britain's death warrant as a Roman province. His message to the British civitates was brutally simple. You're on your own now. Behind those words lay a terrifying reality that would reshape everything we know about early medieval Europe. The mighty Roman Empire, which had conquered the known world, was walking away from one of its most distant provinces, leaving chaos in its wake. But here's what most people don't realize. Lysis wasn't a sudden abandonment. The Romans had been quietly pulling their forces out for years. By 407 CE, the last regular troops had already marched away under Constantine III, a usurper who stripped Britain bare to fuel his continental power grab. What he left behind was a Romano-British elite desperately trying to hold together a crumbling world, while enemies circled like wolves. The Picts hammered down from the north, Irish raiders struck from the west, and everywhere, the carefully maintained Roman systems began falling apart like a house of cards. The administrative machine that had governed Britain since Claudius first set foot on these shores in 43 CE simply vanished overnight. Provincial governors abandoned their posts, urban magistrates fled, military commanders disappeared. The sophisticated network that had kept Britain civilized for centuries crumbled without imperial backing. From the ashes of this collapsing world emerged a figure whose name would echo through history: Arthur. Now, before you roll your eyes thinking about Hollywood knights in shining armor, forget everything you think you know. The real Arthur, if he existed at all, was something far more terrifying and desperate than any fairy tale could capture. Picture a Romano-British warlord in the late 400s, watching Saxon warbands carve up his homeland piece by piece. This wasn't some noble quest for a magical cup. This was survival. The literary legends that grew around Arthur centuries later weren't just fantasy, they were echoes of real battles, real victories, and real hope in humanity's darkest hour. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, recorded something extraordinary in Manether, the Battle of Badon Hill. Somewhere around 500 CE, British forces achieved what seemed impossible. They stopped the Saxon advance cold. For an entire generation, the Germanic expansion ground to a halt. Someone had organized the fragmented British tribes into a fighting force capable of matching the Saxon war machine. Whether that someone was named Arthur, we'll never know for certain. But here's what we do know. The archaeology doesn't lie. Hill forts, like South Cadbury, were massively refortified during exactly this period. Someone with serious resources and military expertise was preparing for war on an unprecedented scale. These weren't desperate refugees hiding behind crumbling walls. These were professional fortifications built by leaders who understood both Roman engineering and Germanic warfare tactics. While British resistance flickered in the west, Saxon kingdoms were crystallizing across the eastern territories with ruthless efficiency. Forget the neat picture of 7 kingdoms peacefully dividing England. The reality was far more brutal and chaotic. These weren't diplomatic agreements carved out in comfortable halls. These were territories seized through blood, fire, and the systematic destruction of everything that came before. Wessex clawed its way into existence along the Thames Valley, its warriors pushing relentlessly westward like a slow-motion avalanche. The very name tells the story: West Saxons, distinguishing themselves from their cousins, establishing Essex and Sussex through identical campaigns of conquest. Archaeological sites at Dorchester reveal layer upon layer of Saxon settlement, each generation pushing deeper into former British territories. Meanwhile, in the Midlands, something even more ambitious was taking shape. Mercia, the kingdom of the border, people Mells emerged as Anglian settlers realized their strategic advantage. Positioned between British resistance in the west and established Saxon kingdoms to the east, they controlled the crossroads of early medieval England. From their power base at places like Repton, which would later become a royal cemetery, Mercian kings would eventually challenge everyone for supremacy. But it was Northumbria that truly defied belief. Stretching from the Humber River to the Scottish borders, This kingdom emerged from the violent merger of two smaller realms, Bernicia and Dera. These weren't peaceful diplomatic unions. They were hostile takeovers that created a military machine capable of simultaneous warfare against British kingdoms, Pictish tribes, and Scottish forces. At Yavering, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary, a wooden amphitheatre where Northumbrian kings held court like Roman emperors, complete with administrative buildings that rival anything the Romans had built. Kent played a completely different game. While other kingdoms expanded through conquest, Kent got rich through trade. Their proximity to continental Europe made them the gateway between Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. The grave goods from sites like Fingalsham reveal wealth that would make modern billionaires jealous. Intricate jewelry, imported luxury goods, and artistic treasures that demonstrate trading networks spanning continents. But wealth and territory meant nothing without the warriors to defend them. These early kingdoms operated on a simple principle that would have made any Roman general nod in approval: loyalty bought with blood and gold. Kings maintained their power through comitatus moria bands bound by personal oaths and sustained through constant warfare and generous gift-giving. The great halls at places like Yavering and Rendlesham weren't just royal residences, they were military headquarters, where kings transformed loot into loyalty through elaborate feasting ceremonies. Archaeological evidence shows these halls could accommodate hundreds of warriors, their benches arranged around central fire hearths, where mead flowed and silver arm rings changed hands, while poets sang of glorious battles. This system demanded constant expansion. Peace meant poverty, and poverty meant rebellion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle preserves memories of the battles that shaped this world, conflicts that weren't just about territory, but about the very survival of entire peoples. When West Saxon forces crushed British resistance at Deorham in 577, they didn't just win a battle being severed the last land connection between British communities in Wales and Cornwall, fragmenting their resistance forever. Similarly, when Northumbrian armies triumphed at Chester around 616, they weren't just expanding westward, they were systematically dismantling centuries of British civilization. Each victory meant more slaves, more tribute, more land to distribute among hungry followers. Each defeat for the British meant entire communities vanishing from history. By the end of the 6th century, these kingdoms had achieved something remarkable, that had created stable, prosperous societies from the wreckage of Roman Britain. The towns were rebuilding, trade networks were expanding, population was growing. The conditions were perfect for the next great transformation. Then, in 597, everything changed again. A small group of monks landed on the Isle of Thanet with a message that would reshape Anglo-Saxon civilization more profoundly than any military conquest. Augustine's mission wasn't just about spreading Christianity, it was about reconnecting Britain with the sophisticated intellectual and cultural traditions of the Mediterranean world. Pope Gregory the Great had planned this mission with the strategic precision of a military campaign. He chose Augustine, an experienced monastery administrator, to lead approximately 40 monks on what everyone understood to be an incredibly dangerous journey. But Gregory had done his homework. King Ethelbert of Kent was married to Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess who had brought her own chaplain and had been quietly worshipping at the old Roman church of St. Martin's in Canterbury for years. When Augustine's party approached Ethelbert, carrying their silver cross and painted icon of Christ while chanting Latin litanies, they were walking into a cultural collision that would define medieval England. Here was Germanic warrior culture, suspicious, practical, rooted in personal loyalty and military prowess, confronting Mediterranean Christianity with its sophisticated theology, written traditions, and imperial associations. The king insisted on meeting outdoors, fearing magical contamination from these foreign monks. But what happened next reveals the calculating intelligence that had made Ethelbert successful. His conversion around 601 wasn't just spiritual minish, it was a masterpiece of political strategy that would transform his kingdom into the most influential realm in early medieval Britain. Ethelbert's conversion wasn't just about personal faith, it was about reshaping an entire legal system. His law code, issued shortly after his baptism, reveals the brilliant political calculation behind royal conversion. These weren't just spiritual guidelines. They were revolutionary legal innovations that would echo through English law for centuries. For the first time in Anglo-Saxon England, stealing from churches carried specific penalties. Bishops were formally integrated into the social hierarchy with defined legal status. Church property gained legal protection that rivaled royal estates. But here's the genius Ethelbert, kept traditional Germanic legal procedures intact. He wasn't replacing Anglo-Saxon law, he was expanding it to accommodate this powerful new institution. Canterbury exploded with construction activity. Christ Church Cathedral rose from the ground alongside St. Augustine's Abbey, creating permanent institutional bases that would outlast any individual king or bishop. Archaeological evidence shows rapid, sophisticated building programs that required resources and expertise on an unprecedented scale. These weren't simple wooden churches, they were stone monuments designed to impress and endure. But the real story of Anglo-Saxon conversion isn't found in royal courts or grand cathedrals. It's buried in village cemeteries and abandoned temples across the English countryside, where ordinary people navigated the collision between ancestral traditions and this compelling new faith. Pope Gregory understood something crucial about human nature. You can't simply erase centuries of religious practice overnight. His letter to Abbot Mellitus, preserved by Bede, reveals a conversion strategy of stunning sophistication. Instead of destroying pagan temples, transform them into churches. Instead of banning animal sacrifices, redirect them into Christian feast days. Work with human psychology, not against it. The archaeology proves this strategy worked brilliantly. At Wing in Buckinghamshire, excavators found a Christian church built directly over a pagan burial ground. The builders weren't trying to hide their pagan past, they were claiming it for Christianity. Similarly, Christian cemeteries from this period contain grave goods that would have horrified later medieval theologians, Germanic weapons and drinking vessels buried alongside gold crosses, creating a material culture that blended both traditions seamlessly. But conversion wasn't uniform across the emerging kingdoms. Each royal court faced unique political pressures that shaped how Christianity took root, and the results were often dramatically different. Essex provides a perfect example of how quickly things could go wrong. King Sabarit's conversion around 604 led to the establishment of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, a triumph that must have seemed permanent. Then Sabarit died, and his pagan sons immediately expelled Bishop Mellitus and officially abandoned Christianity. The Prittlewell burial, discovered in 2003, captures this religious chaos perfectly. A princely grave containing a gold cross alongside traditional Germanic weapons and drinking vessels. Here was a society caught between worlds, unsure which gods deserved loyalty. Northumbria's conversion story reads like something from a dramatic novel. King Edwin's marriage to Athelbert of Kent, around 625, brought Bishop Paulinus northward, establishing a Christian presence at one of Anglo-Saxon England's most powerful courts. But Edwin wasn't easily convinced. According to Bede's account, the king convened a formal council meeting where nobles and advisors debated Christianity's merits like they were discussing military strategy. The speech attributed to an unnamed noble during this council meeting has become one of the most famous passages in early medieval literature. He compared human life to a sparrow flying through a warm hall minuscule, emerging from winter darkness, enjoying brief warmth and light, then disappearing back into the cold unknown. If this new religion could shed light on what came before life and after death, shouldn't they embrace it? Edwin's baptism in 627 at York, in a hastily constructed wooden church on the site of the future York Minster, marked the beginning of systematic Christianization in northern England. Archaeological evidence from Yavering shows the immediate impact amoeba churches erected alongside traditional royal halls, with large rectangular pools constructed specifically for mass baptism ceremonies. The scale suggests hundreds, possibly thousands of conversions following the royal example. But early conversions proved terrifyingly fragile. Edwin's death at Hatfield Chase in 633, fighting a coalition of pagan Mercians and Christian Britons, shattered Northumbrian Christianity almost overnight. Pryndar of Mercia and Cadwallon of Gwynedd didn't just defeat Edwin's army, they systematically devastated Northumbria, forcing the Christian court into exile. The subsequent reigns of Osric in Deira and Eanfrith in Bernicia saw official abandonment of Christianity as royal families reverted to ancestral gods, seeking divine favour in their desperate situation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows disrupted church construction projects and possible destruction of Christian monuments, though the full extent of anti-Christian violence remains debated. Everything changed again in 634 when Oswald won his stunning victory at Heavenfield, restoring Christian Northumbria and launching what would become the golden age of Anglo-Saxon monasticism. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Oswald ignored Canterbury completely and requested missionaries from Iona instead. This wasn't just religious preference, it was sophisticated ecclesiastical politics. The Irish monastery founded by Columba in 563 had developed distinctive traditions that differed from Roman practices in crucial ways. Their monks shaved their heads differently, calculated Easter according to different systems, and organized their monasteries according to Irish rather than continental models. Archaeological excavations on Iona reveal sophisticated stone carving workshops and scriptoria that produced illuminated manuscripts and carved crosses for distribution throughout the Irish sphere of influence. When Aidan arrived at Lindisfarne around 635, he established what would become the most influential monastery in early medieval England. The location was perfect Maite tidal island accessible on foot at low tide, but isolated during high water, providing ideal conditions for contemplative monastic life while maintaining connections to the mainland kingdom. Lindisfarne exploded with activity. Archaeological evidence reveals rapid development of a complex monastic settlement with timber churches, residential buildings, workshops, and cemeteries spreading across the island. The monastery's scriptorium became a powerhouse of manuscript production, creating some of the finest illuminated books in medieval Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715 720 by the monk Edfrith, represent the absolute pinnacle of Northumbrian artistic achievement. This isn't just a religious book, it's a masterpiece that synthesizes Irish, Germanic, and Mediterranean influences in ways that defined insular art for centuries. The manuscript's 259 vellum pages contain the four Gospels written in insular majuscule script, but it's the decorative elements that take your breath away. Elaborate carpet pages feature interlaced animal designs derived from Germanic metalwork traditions. Evangelist portraits show clear Byzantine influence, probably transmitted through imported manuscripts or ivory carvings. The decorative initials incorporate Celtic spiral patterns and zoomorphic interlace that required incredible artistic skill. Recent scientific analysis has revealed something extraordinary about the materials used: neist lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for blue pigments, kermes insects from the Mediterranean for red, and orpiment from volcanic regions for yellow. This demonstrates international trade networks supplying Northumbrian monasteries with luxury materials from across the known world. Meanwhile, at Jarrow, Benedict Biscop founded around 682 what would become the scholarly complement to Lindisfarne's spiritual influence. Archaeological excavations have revealed an extensive complex including multiple churches, residential buildings, workshops, and Europe's earliest known glassmaking furnaces north of the Alps. Benedict Biscop's repeated journeys to Rome assembled the largest library collection in northern Europe. From this remarkable resource base, Bede completed his ecclesiastical history around 731, a work that revolutionized historical writing in medieval Europe through its careful citation of sources, chronological precision, and analytical approach to conflicting accounts. The archaeological evidence from Jarrow Mawage writing tablets, styluses, and book clasps provides physical confirmation of the monastery's scholarly activities. These weren't just religious communities, they were centers of learning that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge while creating new intellectual traditions that would influence European culture for centuries. The year 664 brought one of the most consequential religious meetings in English history, the Synod of Whitby. On the surface, this gathering seemed to debate obscure theological questions about Easter dates and haircuts. In reality, it was a power struggle that would determine whether Anglo-Saxon England aligned with Irish tradition or submitted to Roman authority, with implications that would reshape the entire kingdom. King Oswiu faced an impossible choice. His court was split between two Christian traditions that seemed fundamentally incompatible. The Irish party, led by Bishop Culman of Lindisfarne, defended customs established by revered saints like Columba traditions that had brought Christianity to Northumbria and created its golden age of learning. The Roman party, championed by Wilfrid of Ripon, argued for conformity with continental European practices and papal authority. This wasn't really about religious ritual mishal, it was about political alignment. Would Northumbria remain connected to the Irish sphere of influence that had nurtured its conversion, or would it integrate with the broader European Christian world dominated by Rome? Oswille's decision to adopt Roman practices reflected cold political calculation as much as theological preference. The synod's aftermath triggered seismic changes across Northumbrian monasticism. Archaeological evidence reveals major construction programs at monasteries throughout the kingdom, used stone churches replacing timber structures, modified liturgical arrangements, and increased emphasis on Roman practices. The old Irish traditions weren't completely abandoned, but they were definitely subordinated to continental models. While Northumbria wrestled with religious identity, a different kind of power was rising in the Midlands that would soon dominate all of Anglo-Saxon England. Mercia had been quietly growing stronger under rulers who understood something their rivals missed. Successful kingdoms required both military might and political flexibility. Penda's long reign established Mercia as the dominant force in the Midlands through a combination of aggressive expansion and brilliant strategic thinking. Archaeological evidence from Repton reveals the development of royal centres that perfectly captured Mercian political strategy. The traditional Germanic hall complexes built alongside Christian churches, demonstrating the kingdom's gradual religious transition. Here's what made Penda extraordinary: he remained pagan throughout his entire reign, while permitting Christian missionaries to operate freely within his territories. His sons converted to Christianity, but Penda himself never abandoned the ancestral gods. This wasn't religious confusion, it was political genius. He maintained legitimacy with traditional supporters while positioning Mercia to work with Christian kingdoms when necessary. The Battle of the Winwoad in 655, where Penda died fighting Oswy of Northumbria, seemed like it might end Mercian ambition permanently. Instead, it strengthened the kingdom through political consolidation. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites remains frustratingly limited, but the battle's aftermath is clearly visible through settlement pattern changes and new fortification construction across the region. Penda's son Wulfhere restored Mercian independence around 658 and launched a period of sustained expansion that brought most of southern England under Mercian overlordship. But it was Ethelbald's reign that truly demonstrated what Mercia could achieve when properly organized. Contemporary charters describe Ethelbald as Rex Britanniae, King of Britain, documenting his authority over kingdoms from the Humber to the English Channel. This wasn't empty boasting. Archaeological evidence from Tamworth, the primary Mercian royal centre, shows extensive development during this period, with timber halls, workshops, and defensive earthworks creating a complex that rivaled contemporary continental royal centres. Then, in 2009, archaeologists made a discovery that completely transformed our understanding of Mercian wealth and power. The Staffordshire hoard, dating to the 7th or 8th century, contained over 3,500 gold and silver objects, the sword fittings, helmet fragments, and religious items that may represent battle spoils or royal treasure. The hoard's sheer scale provides dramatic evidence of Mercian military prowess and the vast wealth flowing through 8th century Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But even Ethelbald's achievements paled beside what came next. Offa's accession around 757, following Ethelbald's murder, initiated the most remarkable phase of Mercian supremacy in Anglo-Saxon history. Contemporary Frankish sources describe Offa as Charlemagne's equal Mainz, a ruler capable of negotiating trade agreements and diplomatic marriages that placed Mercia among Europe's major powers. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive administrative development during Offa's reign, standardized pottery production, expanded metalwork industries, and the establishment of planned trading settlements like Hamwick and Ipswich facilitated international commerce on an unprecedented scale. Mercia wasn't just a military power, it was becoming an economic empire. but Offa's most ambitious project would demonstrate royal power in ways that still take your breath away today. The construction of Offa's Dyke represents the most extraordinary engineering achievement undertaken in early medieval Britain, a monument to royal authority that required resources and organizational capabilities beyond anything previously attempted in Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological surveys have revealed a complex earthwork system stretching approximately 150 miles from the Severn Estuary to the Irish Sea. The dyke consists of a substantial earth bank with an accompanying ditch on the Welsh side, a construction project that moved over 12,000 tons of earth per mile, according to recent estimates. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in the dyke's construction layers confirms 8th century construction, while pollen analysis reveals that large sections required massive forest clearance before earthwork construction could begin. This wasn't just manual labor, it was environmental engineering on a continental scale. The dyke served multiple purposes beyond simple frontier defense. Archaeological evidence suggests it controlled trade routes between Wales and England, with gaps in the earthwork corresponding to major river valleys and ancient trackways. The monument's scale and visibility functioned as a powerful symbol of royal authority, demonstrating Offa's ability to mobilize massive labor forces and impose his will across vast territories. Recent archaeological work has identified associated features, including timber palisades, watchtowers, and garrison posts, that transformed the dyke into a comprehensive frontier control system. This wasn't a static barrier, Mayim. It was an active military installation designed to regulate movement and demonstrate royal power to anyone who saw it. The administrative sophistication required for projects like Offa's Dyke is reflected in the legal codes developed during this period. Athelbudus laws, the earliest surviving Germanic legal code written in the vernacular, established precedents that influenced legal development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury includes wax tablets and styluses that may have been used in legal proceedings. In of Wessex's law code, issued around 688 to 694, reveals the complex social structures that had developed in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The laws distinguish between different social classes, establish compensation rates for various crimes, and regulate relationships between lords and dependents. Archaeological evidence from sites like Cowdery's Down supports this social stratification, with clear distinctions between elite residences, featuring substantial timber halls, and smaller buildings occupied by agricultural workers and craftsmen. The emergence of the Witan as a governing institution reflected the adaptation of Germanic traditions to the requirements of territorial kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from royal centres like Yevering and Rendlesham reveals large timber halls capable of accommodating substantial assemblies, while royal charters document the participation of bishops, ealdormen, and other nobles in royal decision-making. The administrative sophistication and cultural achievements of 8th century Anglo-Saxon England created unprecedented wealth that generated both pride and vulnerability. The monasteries overflowed with gold and silver treasures, trading centres bustled with international commerce, royal courts rivaled anything on the continent. This prosperity would soon attract attention from across the North Sea. June 8th, 793, the 8th that would live in terror throughout medieval Europe. The first recorded Viking attack struck Lindisfarne, sending shockwaves through the Christian world that reverberated from Northumbria to Rome. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's stark entry captures the horror. Dire portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. There were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. Archaeological excavations at Lindisfarne reveal the brutal reality behind these apocalyptic descriptions. Burned timber structures, scattered human remains, and a complete absence of the precious metalwork that had characterized earlier phases of the monastery's development tell a story of systematic destruction. This wasn't opportunistic piracy, it was professional warfare conducted by raiders who possessed detailed intelligence about their target. The Vikings demonstrated precise knowledge of the monastery's wealth, the timing of religious festivals when treasures would be displayed, and the site's defensive vulnerabilities. Contemporary sources describe longships appearing suddenly from the North Sea, their crews moving with practiced efficiency to overwhelm the monastery's minimal defenses. The raiders systematically looted church treasures, Mort's gold and silver altar vessels, illuminated manuscripts with jeweled covers, and reliquaries containing saints' remains. Everything portable was seized. Everything else was burned. The attack on Lindisfarne represented far more than the loss of one monastery. It announced the arrival of a new force in European politics, seaborne warriors whose mobility and ruthlessness would challenge every assumption about territorial defense and royal authority. But the horror at Lindisfarne was just the beginning. Archaeological evidence suggests the raiders didn't just steal treasure, they captured monks for the slave trade, a practice that would become a cornerstone of Viking economic activity. These weren't just warriors seeking quick profit, they were entrepreneurs building a business model based on human misery. The psychological damage from Lindisfarne's destruction exceeded even its material losses. Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's chief advisor and former student at the cathedral school, wrote in absolute horror to King Ethelred of Northumbria, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we've now suffered from a pagan race." Think about what this meant. For generations, Anglo-Saxon Christians had believed their monasteries enjoyed divine protection. These were holy places where God's chosen servants pursued spiritual perfection while creating the most beautiful manuscripts and preserving classical learning. The idea that pagan raiders could simply appear from nowhere and destroy everything had been unthinkable. That illusion died on June 8, 793. Archaeological evidence from other Northumbrian monasteries shows the immediate panic that followed. Sites like Jarrow and Monkwearmouth frantically constructed earthwork fortifications and relocated their treasures to more secure inland locations. The age of vulnerable monasteries was over. The success at Lindisfarne unleashed something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The following year, Viking raiders struck Jarrow itself, though they met fiercer resistance and their leader died in the fighting. Archaeological excavations reveal hasty repairs to buildings damaged during this assault, alongside construction of a defensive ditch around the monastic precinct. By 795, the attacks had spread to monasteries in Ireland and Scotland, establishing a coordinated raiding pattern that would terrorize Europe for the next century. This wasn't random violence, it is systematic exploitation of identified weaknesses. The early Viking raids targeted ecclesiastical sites for reasons that went far beyond religious hostility. Monasteries represented the most vulnerable concentrations of treasure in early medieval Europe, communities of scholars and priests, with minimal military protection guarding vast accumulated wealth. Archaeological analysis of hoards buried during this period, like the Pentney hoard discovered in Norfolk, reveals exactly what Vikings sought: silver arm rings, brooches and coins that could be easily transported and quickly converted into currency in Scandinavian markets. The raiders' preference for silver reflected its role as the standard medium of exchange in Baltic trade networks connecting Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Islamic world. These weren't barbarian pirates grabbing random shiny objects. They were sophisticated traders who understood international currency markets and targeted the most liquid assets available in Anglo-Saxon England. The political chaos following Offa's death in 796 created perfect conditions for Viking expansion. Mercian supremacy collapsed, creating a power vacuum that prevented coordinated resistance to Scandinavian attacks. Archaeological evidence from former Mercian territories shows economic disruption and settlement abandonment during this period. Sites like Flixborough experienced dramatic decline in craft production and trade activity. The inability of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to cooperate against external threats allowed Viking raiders to exploit political divisions while establishing secure bases for extended operations. When your enemies can't stop fighting each other, conquest becomes much easier. During the 830s, something fundamental changed in Viking strategy. Leaders began recognizing the potential for permanent territorial conquest rather than seasonal raiding. The arrival of the Great Army in 865 marked this revolutionary shift from quick raids to systematic conquest. Archaeological evidence from Repton, in Derbyshire, where the Viking army established winter quarters in 873-874, reveals the staggering scale of this transformation. Excavations have uncovered a fortified camp built within the ruins of a former royal monastery, complete with defensive earthworks, weapons caches, and mass burial sites containing hundreds of individuals, many showing evidence of violent death. This wasn't temporary occupation. The Vikings were building infrastructure for permanent control. The Great Army's campaigns demonstrated military organization and strategic planning that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. Led initially by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the force moved systematically through Anglo-Saxon territories, exploiting political weaknesses while establishing control over key strategic locations. Archaeological evidence from York, captured by Vikings in 866, shows rapid transformation from Anglo-Saxon administrative centre to Scandinavian commercial hub. Excavations in the Coppergate area reveal extensive Viking-age craft production, leatherworking, metalworking, and amber carving that connected York to trade networks spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. The establishment of the Danelaw created a parallel Scandinavian society within England that would profoundly influence English culture and language for centuries. The boundary established by Alfred's treaty with Guthrum around 886 ran roughly from London to Chester, dividing England between Anglo-Saxon territories in the south and west and Scandinavian-controlled areas in the north and east. Archaeological evidence reveals distinct material culture differences across this boundary. Scandinavian-influenced pottery styles, metalwork traditions, and settlement patterns became clearly distinguishable from contemporary Anglo-Saxon material culture. Two civilizations were developing side by side within the same island. But here's what makes the Viking settlement story truly fascinating. Scandinavian colonization differed markedly from earlier Anglo-Saxon conquest. Rather than displacing existing populations, Viking settlers often integrated with Anglo-Saxon communities, creating hybrid societies that blended cultural traditions. Archaeological excavations at sites like West Heselton in Yorkshire reveal cemeteries containing both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon burial practices. Some graves contain distinctively Scandinavian oval brooches alongside Anglo-Saxon jewelry. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains indicates that many individuals buried with Scandinavian grave goods were actually born in England, suggesting rapid cultural assimilation rather than ethnic replacement. The linguistic impact of Scandinavian settlement fundamentally altered English language development. Archaeological evidence from York and Lincoln shows extensive Scandinavian settlement corresponding exactly to areas where Old Norse linguistic influence remains strongest in modern English dialects. The survival of hundreds of Scandinavian place names throughout northern and eastern England provides clear evidence of settlement density and cultural integration. Place names ending in Mearby, Thorpe, and Toft cluster heavily in areas of documented Viking settlement, while distinctively Scandinavian personal names in legal documents demonstrate continued cultural identity among settler communities. The administrative systems established in Scandinavian territories adapted Germanic legal traditions to English conditions. The establishment of the 5 boroughs Mouse Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford created a network of fortified administrative centres controlling surrounding territories through combined military force and legal authority. Archaeological excavations at these sites reveal substantial defensive earthworks, planned street systems, and evidence of specialized craft production supporting both military garrisons and civilian populations. These weren't just Viking strongholds, they were sophisticated urban centers rivaling anything in contemporary Europe. Into this chaos stepped one of history's most remarkable figures. Alfred's rise to power in Wessex occurred during the crisis years of sustained Viking pressure. His accession in 871, following his brother Ethelred's death, came at a moment when Wessex faced immediate existential threat from the Great Army. Archaeological evidence from Reading, where Vikings established a fortified camp in 870, demonstrates how close Scandinavian forces had come to the West Saxon heartland. The series of battles fought during Alfred's first year as king came to defeats at Reading and Wilton, victory at Ashdown, established warfare patterns that would characterize the next phase of Anglo-Saxon resistance. But Alfred would prove to be far more than just another warrior king desperately fighting for survival. He was about to transform both the nature of kingship and the very concept of English identity in ways that would echo through history for 1,000 years. January 878 brought Alfred to the absolute brink of annihilation. Guthrum's surprise winter attack wasn't just militarily devastating, it shattered every assumption about seasonal warfare that had governed medieval combat for centuries. Nobody attacked in winter. Armies went home. Kings waited for spring. Guthrum ignored these ancient rules and nearly destroyed Anglo-Saxon civilization in a single stroke. The assault forced Alfred into exile deep within the Somerset marshes, a retreat so desperate that it seemed like the final chapter of West Saxon resistance. Archaeological evidence from Athelney, where Alfred established his refuge, reveals the hasty fortification of naturally defensible positions using whatever materials were available, timber palisades, and crude earthwork defenses thrown up by a king fighting for his very survival. But here's what makes Alfred's story extraordinary. Even in this seemingly hopeless situation, he maintained resistance from his remote base through something Vikings had consistently underestimated: local loyalty. The population surrounding Alfred's refuge had experienced the harsh realities of Viking rule firsthand and overwhelmingly preferred familiar West Saxon authority to Scandinavian domination. They provided food, intelligence, and manpower to a king who refused to surrender. Alfred's victory at Edington in May 878 marked far more than a single battlefield triumph. It signaled the beginning of systematic West Saxon recovery and the development of revolutionary defensive strategies that would transform medieval warfare. The battle's aftermath, including Guthrum's baptism and the establishment of formal territorial boundaries, created the political framework for sustained resistance to further Scandinavian expansion. Archaeological evidence from sites along the established frontier shows immediate construction of defensive works and rapid development of administrative systems capable of coordinating resistance across multiple territories. Alfred wasn't just pushing back Vikings' meat, he was reimagining how kingdoms could defend themselves. The burh system represented Alfred's most brilliant military innovation, creating a network of fortified settlements that provided security for agricultural populations while serving as bases for coordinated military operations. Archaeological excavations at sites like Cricklade and Wallingford reveal sophisticated engineering that characterized these fortifications. The defenses typically consisted of substantial earthwork ramparts topped with timber palisades, with internal street systems laid out according to plan designs that maximized defensive efficiency while accommodating civilian populations. These weren't just military installations, they were fortified towns designed to support both soldiers and farmers, craftsmen and traders. The Burgal Hidage, a document listing the burhs and their defensive requirements, reveals the systematic precision of Alfred's fortification program. Each burh was assigned a specific number of hides, units of agricultural land responsible for maintaining designated sections of defensive walls. Archaeological analysis of surviving earthworks confirms the document's remarkable accuracy, with wall lengths corresponding closely to the maintenance requirements specified in the text. The system's effectiveness depended on something revolutionary: the ability to mobilize agricultural populations for military service, while maintaining food production necessary to sustain both civilian and military populations. Alfred had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued medieval warfare: how to defend territory without destroying the economy that supported defense. Alfred's legal innovations complemented his military reforms by creating administrative systems capable of governing expanded territories with unprecedented efficiency. His law code, compiled around 890, synthesized legal traditions from multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, while incorporating Christian principles derived from biblical and canonical sources. Archaeological evidence from Winchester, Alfred's primary royal centre, reveals the development of specialized administrative buildings that supported this legal revolution. A royal palace complex, ecclesiastical centers, and workshops produced the manuscripts necessary for governmental record-keeping on a scale that rivaled continental European kingdoms. The king's educational initiatives addressed cultural devastation caused by decades of warfare and political disruption with characteristic thoroughness. Alfred's preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care lamented the decline of learning in England, noting that few people south of the Humber could understand Latin or translate basic texts. Archaeological evidence supports this devastating assessment. Excavations at formerly important monastic centres like Glastonbury reveal evidence of abandonment and destruction during the late 9th century. Alfred's programme of translation and education aimed to restore intellectual culture while creating an educated administrative class capable of governing his expanded kingdom. The development of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle during Alfred's reign provided a powerful tool for political legitimacy and historical memory. The Chronicle's compilation drew upon earlier annalistic records, royal genealogies, and contemporary accounts to create a coherent narrative of Anglo-Saxon history that emphasized West Saxon leadership and divine favor. Archaeological evidence from scriptoria at Winchester and other West Saxon centers reveals the material infrastructure necessary for manuscript production, writing tablets, styluses, and evidence of parchment preparation that supported the Chronicle's compilation and distribution. This wasn't just historical record-keeping, it was sophisticated propaganda designed to legitimize West Saxon authority. Alfred's successors built upon his defensive innovations to launch systematic campaigns for the reconquest of Scandinavian territories with ruthless efficiency. Edward the Elder's accession in 899 initiated a phase of aggressive expansion that would ultimately reunify England under West Saxon rule through a combination of military brilliance and administrative consolidation. The king's strategy combined military conquest with immediate administrative integration, establishing new burhs in conquered territories while extending West Saxon legal and administrative systems throughout recovered areas. Each victory became the foundation for the next campaign. The campaigns against the southern Danelaw during the first decade of the 10th century demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Alfred's military innovations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bedford and Northampton shows clear evidence of siege warfare and defensive modifications as Anglo-Saxon forces systematically reduced Scandinavian strongholds. The construction of new burhs at strategic locations like Hertford and Witham provided bases for further operations while securing conquered territories against counterattack. Edward had perfected his father's defensive system and weaponized it for conquest. Edward's alliance with his sister Aelflad, the Lady of the Mercians, created unprecedented cooperation between Wessex and Mercia that proved decisive in the reconquest campaigns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Chester and Runcorn reveals extensive fortification work undertaken during Aelflad's rule, with defensive earthworks and planned urban development that paralleled contemporary West Saxon burh construction. The coordination between brother and sister in establishing complementary defensive networks demonstrates sophisticated strategic planning that maximized available resources while minimizing opportunities for Scandinavian resistance. They transformed defensive warfare into an offensive weapon. The conquest of York in 927 by Aethelstan marked the culmination of West Saxon expansion and the first unification of England under a single ruler. Archaeological evidence from York reveals significant changes in material culture following the Anglo-Saxon conquest, with the replacement of Scandinavian-influenced pottery styles and metalwork by objects reflecting southern English traditions. However, the archaeological record also shows remarkable continuity in many aspects of urban life, suggesting that Aethelstan's administration incorporated existing Scandinavian administrative and commercial systems rather than imposing wholesale cultural transformation. This was conquest through integration rather than destruction. Aethelstan's reign witnessed the development of royal ceremonial and administrative practices that reflected England's new status as a unified kingdom. Archaeological excavations at sites like Kingston upon Thames, where several 10th century kings were crowned, reveal evidence of elaborate royal ceremonies that combined Germanic traditions with Christian symbolism. The king's court attracted scholars and craftsmen from throughout Europe, creating cultural exchanges that enriched Anglo-Saxon artistic and intellectual traditions while establishing England's reputation as a major European power. The kingdom that had nearly died in Somerset marshes was becoming a continental force. But the revival of Scandinavian attacks during the late 10th century under Swine Forkbeard reflected changing political conditions in both England and Scandinavia. The accession of Ethelred the Unready in 978, following Edward the Martyr's assassination, created political instability that Scandinavian leaders were quick to exploit. Archaeological evidence from sites like Maldon in Essex, where Buritnath's forces were defeated in 991, reveals the resumption of large-scale warfare after decades of relative peace. Battle site excavations have uncovered weapons and human remains that provide physical evidence of the fierce fighting described in the contemporary poem, commemorating Buritnath's heroic but ultimately futile resistance. The payment of Danegeld represented a fundamental shift in English defensive strategy from military resistance to financial appeasement. Archaeological evidence reveals the enormous wealth that 10th century England had accumulated through agricultural development and international trade, making tribute payments feasible even as they encouraged further attacks. The unified kingdom that Alfred's descendants had created through blood and brilliance would soon face its greatest test, not from raiders seeking quick profit, but from kings seeking permanent conquest. The final chapter of Anglo-Saxon England was about to begin. The wealth that made England such a tempting target is perfectly captured in archaeological discoveries like the Querdale hoard found in Lancashire PT, thousands of silver coins from England, Scandinavia, and Islamic territories, proving that international trade networks had generated the massive wealth used to purchase temporary peace from Viking raiders. But money could only buy time, not security. Sweyn's conquest of England in 1013 represented the devastating culmination of decades of renewed Scandinavian pressure that Ethelred's government simply couldn't withstand. Archaeological evidence from Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, where Sweyn established his headquarters, reveals the rapid transformation of English administrative centres to accommodate Scandinavian rule. The infrastructure of Anglo-Saxon government was being systematically replaced. Sweyn's sudden death in 1014 created a succession crisis that temporarily restored English independence under Ethelred. But the underlying political and military weaknesses that had enabled Scandinavian success remained completely unresolved. The respite was brief and illusory. Cnot's decisive victory in 1016 established the most successful Scandinavian kingdom in medieval Europe, ruling territories that stretched from England to Denmark and Norway. Archaeological evidence from Winchester and London reveals something remarkable: the continuity of administrative systems under Scandinavian rule. Cnut wasn't destroying English government, he was adopting existing governmental practices while maintaining connections to Scandinavian political traditions. The King's Law Code synthesized Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian legal traditions, creating hybrid systems that reflected the cultural complexity of his diverse territories. This wasn't cultural replacement might, it was sophisticated integration on an unprecedented scale. The succession crisis following Cnut's death in 1035 ultimately restored English rule under Edward the Confessor in 1042. But the kingdom that emerged differed fundamentally from its Anglo-Saxon predecessors. Archaeological evidence reveals profound cultural changes wrought by centuries of Scandinavian influence. Material culture, settlement patterns, and administrative practices reflected a synthesis of Germanic, Scandinavian, and Christian traditions that would characterize medieval England forever. The stage was set for the final transformation that would occur in 1066, when competing claims to Edward's inheritance would bring Norman, Norwegian, and Anglo-Saxon armies into conflict for control of the English throne. Edward the Confessor's death on January 5, 1066, precipitated the most significant succession crisis in English history. Three powerful claimants asserted legitimate rights to the throne, each backed by military force and political calculation that would reshape European civilization. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful nobleman in England, claimed Edward had designated him heir on his deathbed. Duke William of Normandy insisted that Edward had promised him the succession years earlier, and that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim during a visit to Normandy around 1064. Harald Hardrada of Norway based his claim on an agreement between his predecessor Magnus and Harthacnut, Cnut's son, which had promised the survivor rights to both kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from Westminster Abbey, where Edward was buried, reveals the magnificent Romanesque church he had constructed as his memorial. Its substantial stone walls and elaborate carved capitals demonstrated the wealth and continental connections that made England such an attractive prize for ambitious rulers. The Witten's selection of Harold Godwinson reflected practical political considerations rather than strict hereditary succession. Harold possessed the military experience, territorial base, and administrative connections necessary to govern effectively during a period of external threat. His coronation at Westminster Abbey on January 6, the day after Edward's funeral, demonstrated the desperate urgency with which English nobles moved to establish legitimate authority before foreign claimants could organize invasions. Archaeological excavations at Bosham in Sussex, Harold's primary residence, reveal a substantial stone church and associated buildings that served as the centre of his earldom, evidence of international trade connections, including pottery from northern France and metalwork from Scandinavia, shows how interconnected the medieval world had become by 1066. William's reaction to news of Harold's coronation combined genuine outrage with calculated political maneuvering. The Norman Duke had spent decades consolidating control over his fractious duchy, surviving assassination attempts, rebellious barons, and French royal interference to establish one of medieval Europe's most effective military states. Archaeological evidence from sites like Falaise and Caen reveals the sophisticated castle-building program that had secured Norman territories with massive stone keeps and defensive earthworks, demonstrating advanced military engineering. William's court at Rouen attracted knights, clerics, and administrators from throughout northern France, creating a cosmopolitan environment that blended Scandinavian military traditions with Frankish administrative practices and reformed Christian spirituality. The papal blessing obtained by William for his invasion represented a diplomatic masterstroke that transformed a dynastic dispute into a holy war. Pope Alexander II's grant of a papal banner reflected the reform movement's support for Norman claims about English ecclesiastical irregularities, including allegations of simony, clerical marriage, and resistance to continental reforms. Archaeological evidence from Norman monasteries like Jumièges and Mont Saint-Michel reveals the architectural and liturgical innovations that reformers sought to impose throughout Europe. Elaborate stone churches featuring innovative vaulting techniques and sculptural programs emphasized papal authority and clerical celibacy with unprecedented artistic sophistication. The construction of William's invasion fleet during summer 1066 required unprecedented logistical coordination that revealed Norman organizational capabilities. Contemporary sources describe the assembly of approximately 700 vessels at Dives-sur-Mer, ranging from large transport ships capable of carrying horses to smaller vessels designed for rapid coastal operations. Archaeological excavations of medieval shipyards in Normandy have revealed evidence of specialized techniques used in constructing these vessels. Overlapping planks secured by iron rivets and waterproofed with tar and animal hair created ships capable of transporting not only troops but also horses, siege equipment, and prefabricated castle components. The systematic planning that characterized Norman military operations was about to be tested against English resistance. Harold Hardrada's simultaneous invasion of northern England created the strategic nightmare that would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome. The Norwegian king's reputation as the greatest warrior of his generation was well established through decades of campaigning in the Mediterranean, where he had served in the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard and accumulated enormous wealth through military service and controlled piracy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Trondheim reveals the sophisticated metalwork traditions that produced weapons and armor used by Norwegian forces. Pattern-welded swords and elaborate helmets combined functional effectiveness with symbolic display of royal authority that intimidated enemies across Europe. The alliance between Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, provided the Norwegian invasion with crucial local support and intelligence about English defensive preparations. Tostig's intimate knowledge of Yorkshire geography and political loyalties enabled Norwegian forces to navigate the complex waterways of the Humber estuary and establish secure bases for operations against York. Archaeological excavations at sites like Stamford Bridge reveal evidence of substantial settlements that supported the Norwegian army during its brief occupation of the region. Temporary fortifications and evidence of systematic requisitioning of local food supplies show how quickly foreign armies could establish operational control over English territories. The Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Norwegian military tactics against conventional English forces. Earl Edwin of Mercia and Earl Morcar of Northumbria commanded approximately 6,000 troops, primarily furred levies, supplemented by professional warriors from their household retinues. The battle's outcome would force Harold Godwinson into the impossible choice that would define English history: the march north to face the greatest warrior in Europe, or remain south to confront the most sophisticated military machine in medieval France. Either decision meant leaving England's other frontier completely exposed to invasion. The events of 1066 were about to determine not just who would rule England, but what kind of civilization England would become. 3 armies, 3 cultures, 3 visions of medieval kingship were converging on a single kingdom, whose fate would reshape European history for centuries to come. The marshy ground south of York at Fulford created a tactical nightmare that should have favoured English defensive tactics, but the Norwegian forces brought something the English couldn't match: to superior discipline and decades of coordinated combat experience. The battle site became a killing field where English resistance collapsed under systematic assault. Recent archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of these final battles. Metal detectorists working near Stamford Bridge have uncovered Viking axes and Saxon spears, potentially the first physical evidence ever found of the legendary engagement. These finds, including weapons from both armies, suggest the fierce fighting described in contemporary sources wasn't exaggerated. The catastrophic English casualties at Fulford eliminated organised resistance throughout northern England, leaving Harold facing an impossible strategic situation. His forced march northward covered approximately 180 miles in just 4 days, a logistical achievement that demonstrated the remarkable effectiveness of communication systems and administrative arrangements supporting Anglo-Saxon military operations. The king's ability to mobilize forces from southern England and coordinate their movement with surviving northern troops reflected decades of administrative development that had created sophisticated governmental machinery. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Great North Road reveals the Roman infrastructure that made this rapid military movement possible: stone bridges and paved surfaces that remained functional despite centuries of limited maintenance. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, ranks among the most decisive encounters in medieval military history. Harold Hardrada and Tostig had positioned their forces on the east bank of the River Derwent, expecting to receive hostages and tribute from York rather than face immediate battle. The Norwegian army's casual dispersal across the countryside, with many warriors leaving their armour at ships anchored at Rickle, reflected their absolute confidence in English submission following their victory at Fulford. Archaeological investigation of the battlefield has revealed evidence of the bridge that gave the engagement its name. Stone foundations and timber superstructure created a natural choke point where small numbers of defenders could hold off larger attacking forces, exactly the tactical situation described in medieval sources. The legendary account of a single Norwegian warrior holding the bridge against the entire English army, though probably exaggerated in later sources, reflects the genuine tactical significance of river crossings in medieval warfare. Archaeological evidence suggests the original bridge was narrow enough that individual combat could indeed control access, with the defender's position protected by the river's current and the bridge's elevation above surrounding terrain. The English victory required coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Some forces crossed the river upstream to outflank the Norwegian position, while others maintained pressure at the bridge itself, demonstrating tactical sophistication that matched anything in contemporary European warfare. Harold Hardrada's death during the battle eliminated one of medieval Europe's most formidable military leaders and effectively ended Norwegian ambitions for English conquest. Contemporary sources describe the king's death from an arrow wound to the throat, though archaeological evidence cannot confirm specific details of individual casualties. The Norwegian army's collapse following their leader's death demonstrated the intensely personal nature of medieval military leadership. Warrior loyalty was tied directly to individual commanders rather than abstract political concepts. When the king died, the army disintegrated. The survivors' retreat to their ships at Rickle required only 24 vessels to transport the remnants of an army that had arrived in over 300 ships. indicating the staggering scale of Norwegian casualties. Harold had achieved one of the most complete victories in medieval warfare. But Harold's celebration at York was shattered by devastating news. William's landing at Pevensey on September 28th forced the English king to undertake another exhausting march southward. With forces already depleted by the northern campaign, the timing of William's invasion, delayed for weeks by unfavourable winds, proved fortuitous in catching Harold between two major military commitments. Archaeological evidence from Pevensey reveals the remains of the Roman fort that provided William's forces with immediate defensive positions. Substantial stone walls and strategic location controlling access routes inland from the coast gave the Normans a perfect beachhead for their invasion. William's establishment of a fortified base at Hastings demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized Norman military operations. Rather than advancing immediately inland, Norman forces constructed a motte and bailey castle using prefabricated wooden components transported with the invasion fleet. Archaeological excavations at Hastings Castle have revealed evidence of these original timber fortifications, buste holes, and defensive ditches that provided security for the Norman beachhead, while serving as a base for systematic ravaging of the surrounding countryside, designed to force Harold into premature battle. The devastation of the Sussex countryside represented deliberate psychological warfare intended to undermine Harold's legitimacy by demonstrating his inability to protect his subjects. Contemporary sources describe systematic burning of villages, slaughter of livestock, and destruction of crops that created streams of refugees fleeing toward London. Archaeological evidence from sites like Battle and Sedlescombe reveals layers of ash and destruction dating to this period, burned timber buildings and scattered metal objects that confirm the intensity of Norman ravaging operations. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated terror designed to force Harold into battle. Harold's decision to advance directly from London to confront William, rather than adopting defensive strategies, reflected both personal honour and practical political considerations. The king's reputation as a successful military commander demanded aggressive action against foreign invaders, while delayed response risked allowing William to establish permanent fortifications and attract additional continental reinforcements. Archaeological evidence from sites along Watling Street reveals the Roman road system that facilitated Harold's rapid advance. Though the forced marches required to reach the battlefield left his forces exhausted and reduced in number, the English army that assembled at Colbeck Hill on October 13, 1066, represented a mixture of professional warriors and hastily assembled militia forces. Harold's housecarls, armed with two-handed Danish axes and equipped with mail hauberks and iron helmets, formed the army's elite corps, supplemented by the gens from southern shires and furred levies called up for national defence. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards buried during this period reveals the quality of English military equipment. Peter pattern-welded swords, spearheads with elaborate socket decorations, and shield bosses that combined functional effectiveness with artistic sophistication. The battlefield chosen by Harold occupied a narrow ridge approximately 600 yards long, with steep slopes on both flanks that prevented outflanking maneuvers, while concentrating the fighting along a predictable front. Archaeological investigation has confirmed the tactical advantages of the English position, the slopes gradient creating natural obstacles to cavalry charges, while providing elevated positions for missile weapons. The famous apple tree that marked the centre of the English line, mentioned in contemporary sources, probably served as both a rallying point and command post during the extended fighting that would determine England's future. The Norman army's composition reflected the international character of William's expedition. Contingents from Normandy, Brittany, Flanders, and other French territories were united by feudal obligations and promises of English land grants. The force's organisation into three divisions, Bretons on the left, Normans in the centre, and French and Flemish troops on the right, demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning that maximised the effectiveness of different fighting styles and equipment types. Modern historians estimate William's forces at between 7,000 and 12,000 men, consisting roughly of equal numbers of cavalry, infantry, and archers or crossbowmen. This combined arms approach would prove decisive against Harold's primarily infantry-based army, despite the English advantages in position and defensive preparation. The stage was set for a battle that would end Anglo-Saxon England forever and begin a new chapter in European history. Two exhausted armies faced each other across a Sussex ridge, carrying the weight of centuries of cultural development, political ambition, and national survival. The outcome would determine not just who ruled England, but what kind of civilization England would become for the next 1,000 years. Archaeological discoveries from Norman military sites reveal the standardized equipment that made these forces so devastatingly effective. Kite-shaped shields, mail hauberks, and conical helmets provided superior protection while maintaining the mobility essential for combined arms tactics. This wasn't just better equipment. It represented a completely different approach to medieval warfare that would revolutionize European combat. The Battle of Hastings began at approximately 9 a.m. on October 14th, 1066, with Norman archers advancing within range of the English shield wall. The initial missile exchange perfectly demonstrated the contrasting tactical philosophies of both armies. Norman crossbowmen and archers sought to disrupt English formations, while Harold's forces maintained defensive positions designed to absorb and repel frontal attacks. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield tells the story of this deadly opening phase. Arrowheads and crossbow bolts scattered across the slope where the English line stood confirm the intensity of this preliminary bombardment. Iron points designed specifically for penetrating mail armor reveal the professional preparation that characterized Norman military planning. The first Norman cavalry charge encountered disciplined resistance that had characterized English defensive tactics for centuries. The housecarls' two-handed axes proved devastatingly effective against mounted attackers. Weapons with long handles and heavy blades capable of killing horses and riders with single blows. Contemporary sources describe the terrifying sound of axes striking shields and armor, creating a din that echoed across the battlefield while the English battle cry of "Oat" thundered along the ridge. Archaeological analysis of weapon damage patterns from contemporary sites confirms that axe wounds were indeed capable of penetrating mail armor worn by Norman cavalry, validating the effectiveness of English defensive tactics. But around midday, everything changed through either tactical brilliance or fortunate improvisation that would seal England's fate. The false retreat that broke the English left wing exploited the third's fatal lack of battlefield discipline. When Breton forces on the Norman left appeared to flee in disorder, English militia forces abandoned their defensive positions to pursue what they believed was a defeated enemy. The Bretons' sudden turn to attack their scattered pursuers demonstrated the superior training and coordination that characterized Norman military forces. Cavalry units capable of complex maneuvers under battlefield conditions represented a level of tactical sophistication that the English simply couldn't match. Archaeological evidence suggests this phase of the battle occurred on the lower slopes where pursuing English forces became fatally vulnerable to coordinated counterattacks. The disciplined shield wall that had held all morning was beginning to fragment under the pressure of professional warfare. The afternoon fighting centered on repeated Norman attempts to break the increasingly contracted English line through coordinated infantry, archery, and cavalry attacks. William's personal leadership proved crucial during this phase, with the Duke reportedly having 3 horses killed beneath him while leading charges against the English centre. Contemporary sources describe his dramatic removal of his helmet to demonstrate his survival when rumours of his death began circulating among Norman forces. This perfectly illustrates the intensely personal nature of medieval military leadership and the psychological factors that determined battlefield outcomes. Harold's death during the final Norman assault remains one of medieval history's most debated episodes, with contemporary sources providing conflicting accounts of whether the king died from an arrow wound to the eye or from sword cuts inflicted during hand-to-hand combat. Archaeological investigation of the battlefield has failed to locate Harold's burial site or provide physical evidence of his death, though the immediate collapse of English resistance following the king's fall suggests that his demise was clearly recognized by both armies. The famous scene depicted in the Bayeux tapestry, showing a figure with an arrow in his eye, followed by another being cut down by a mounted warrior, may represent 2 separate moments in Harold's final struggle rather than alternative versions of the same event. The king may have suffered both wounds in his last desperate stand. The systematic Norman pursuit of fleeing English forces continued until nightfall, with cavalry units hunting down scattered groups of furred levies who lacked the discipline to maintain organized retreat. Archaeological evidence from sites along probable retreat routes includes scattered weapons and equipment abandoned by fleeing soldiers, confirming contemporary accounts of the pursuit's devastating intensity. The deaths of Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine during the battle eliminated potential leaders for continued English resistance, while casualties among the housecarls and the Neens destroyed the military elite that had sustained Anglo-Saxon royal authority for generations. The entire command structure of Anglo-Saxon England had been decapitated in a single afternoon. William's cautious advance toward London, following his victory at Hastings, demonstrated the strategic uncertainty that persisted despite tactical success. Rather than marching directly on the capital, Norman forces moved eastward to Dover, securing the crucial port that controlled communications with Normandy, while avoiding immediate confrontation with whatever English forces might remain in the field. Archaeological evidence from Dover Castle reveals extensive modifications undertaken during this period. Norman engineers strengthened existing fortifications while constructing additional defensive works that secured their primary supply route. William understood that conquest required logistics, not just battlefield victories. Canterbury's submission marked the beginning of systematic Norman occupation of southeastern England. The city's ecclesiastical importance made its peaceful surrender politically significant, demonstrating Norman respect for church property while establishing precedent for collaboration between English religious authorities and foreign conquerors. Archaeological excavations at Canterbury Cathedral have revealed evidence of rapid architectural changes that followed Norman conquest. Construction began almost immediately on a new cathedral that would replace the Anglo-Saxon structure with a building reflecting continental architectural traditions. Even the stones would be Norman. The ravaging of Surrey and Hampshire represented deliberate economic warfare designed to pressure London's population into submission through starvation and refugee influx. Norman forces systematically destroyed agricultural resources, burned settlements, and slaughtered livestock across a broad swath of territory surrounding the capital. Archaeological evidence from sites like Guildford and Winchester reveals layers of destruction dating to this period, burned timber buildings and scattered metal objects, confirming the intensity of Norman devastation campaigns. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated terror designed to break English will to resist. The brief reign of Edgar Atheling, following Harold's death, reflected the English nobility's desperate attempt to maintain legitimate resistance to Norman conquest. The teenage prince's claim to the throne derived from his descent from Edmund Ironside, though his youth and complete lack of military experience made effective leadership impossible under the circumstances. Archaeological evidence from sites like Berkhamsted, where Edgar's supporters made their final submission to William, reveals hasty fortification efforts undertaken by English forces seeking to establish defensive positions against Norman advance. These pathetic earthworks tell the story of a civilization's final futile gasps. William's coronation at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, marked the formal establishment of Norman rule, though the ceremony's disruption by violence demonstrated the fragility of the new regime's authority. Contemporary sources describe how the Norman Guard's misinterpretation of shouting from inside the abbey led to attacks on surrounding buildings, creating fires that illuminated the coronation ceremony while terrified English nobles fled the church. It was a fitting end to Anglo-Saxon England, the civilization that had survived Roman withdrawal, Saxon invasion, Viking conquest, and Danish rule finally succumbing to Norman efficiency. The crown that Athelstan had first worn as king of all England passed to a foreign duke who would transform everything from language to law, architecture to administration. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's final entries capture the magnitude of this transformation with stark simplicity, and William came to this land and won it. 6 centuries of Anglo-Saxon civilization, the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, the golden age of Northumbrian monasticism, Alfred's legal reforms, and the cultural synthesis that had created early medieval England, ended with those simple words. But from the ashes of conquest would emerge something new, Mito, a hybrid Anglo-Norman civilization that would combine the best of both traditions while creating innovations that would influence European development for centuries to come. The Norman conquest wasn't just the end of Anglo-Saxon England, It was the beginning of medieval England's transformation into a European superpower. Archaeological evidence from Westminster tells a chilling story of systematic violence and reconstruction. The substantial rebuilding required following the coronation riots reveals repairs to damaged structures alongside new construction, reflecting Norman architectural preferences. Even the stones bore witness to conquest, English masonry, giving way to continental designs that would dominate the landscape for centuries. The establishment of Norman administrative control required something far more systematic than battlefield victory. The complete replacement of English officials with continental appointees who possessed both the linguistic skills and unwavering political loyalty necessary for governing a hostile population. This wasn't just changing management, it was cultural eradication through bureaucracy. Archaeological evidence from Winchester, the traditional heart of English royal administration, reveals rapid transformation in material culture as Norman officials established new governmental procedures while adapting existing administrative systems to continental practices. The physical artifacts tell the story, Saxon administrative tools disappearing, replaced by Norman writing materials and record-keeping systems. Remarkably, some Anglo-Saxon administrative documents survived this transition, demonstrating the continuity of certain governmental functions even as political control shifted to foreign rulers. The Normans were pragmatic conquerors. They destroyed what threatened them while preserving what served them. But the most visible and terrifying symbol of Norman domination wasn't administrative, it was architectural. The construction of motte and bailey castles across conquered territories represented both the primary mechanism for maintaining military control over hostile populations and a psychological weapon designed to break English resistance. These fortifications, built using impressed English labour under Norman supervision, combined speed of construction with devastating tactical effectiveness. They created secure bases for garrison forces while demonstrating Norman power to local populations with unmistakable clarity: submit or face the consequences. Archaeological excavations at sites like Windsor and Warwick reveal the sophisticated engineering that characterized these early Norman castles. Carefully planned earthworks and timber structures maximized defensive capabilities while minimizing construction time and materials. These weren't temporary installations, they were permanent statements of conquest. But the most systematic and brutal campaign of the entire conquest was yet to come. The harrying of the north during the winter of 1069 to 1070 represented something unprecedented in medieval warfare. Systematic economic destruction, designed to eliminate the resource base supporting continued English resistance in Yorkshire and surrounding regions. William's forces moved methodically across the landscape, like a plague of locusts, destroying settlements, slaughtering livestock, and burning stored grain supplies that would have sustained populations through the winter months. This wasn't military conquest, it was deliberate genocide through starvation. Archaeological evidence from York and Durham reveals the staggering extent of this devastation. Layers of ash and destruction confirm contemporary accounts of widespread burning and systematic economic warfare that defies comprehension. Entire communities simply vanished from the historical record. The demographic impact created a wasteland that persisted for decades. Domesday Book entries from 1086 still recorded vast areas of Yorkshire as waste nearly 20 years after the campaign. It's a testament to destruction so complete that the land itself couldn't recover. Archaeological survey work has identified hundreds of deserted settlement sites dating to this period, with evidence of hasty abandonment that tells heartbreaking stories. Buried coin hoards and scattered household goods suggest populations fled with minimal warning, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. The campaign's effectiveness in eliminating organized resistance came at enormous human cost. Contemporary sources suggest that famine and disease killed more people than direct military action, making William's strategy even more terrifyingly efficient. Yet even this systematic brutality couldn't completely crush English resistance. In the Fenlands, something extraordinary emerged: the rebellion of Hereward the Wake, representing the most sustained English resistance to Norman rule. By exploiting the region's treacherous terrain and the leadership of a charismatic warrior who embodied Anglo-Saxon military traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ely, reveals the natural advantages that made the fenlands nearly impregnable to conventional military operations. Islands of firm ground surrounded by marshes that could only be crossed by those familiar with local conditions created a natural fortress that Norman heavy cavalry couldn't penetrate. Hereward's ability to maintain resistance for several years demonstrated both the limitations of Norman military power and the persistence of English opposition to foreign rule. Here was proof that the conquest wasn't complete, that Anglo-Saxon England could still fight back. But William's response to the Ely Rebellion revealed the same systematic approach that had characterized his entire conquest. The siege of Ely required innovative engineering solutions that demonstrated Norman adaptability and absolute determination to eliminate all centers of resistance. William's construction of a causeway across the marshes using timber, stone, and earth to create a solid roadway capable of supporting heavily armed troops represented a massive undertaking requiring enormous resources and sophisticated planning. Archaeological investigation of the probable causeway route has revealed evidence of timber structures and stone foundations confirming the scale of this engineering project. The fall of Ely marked the end of organized Anglo-Saxon resistance, but the systematic replacement of English landholders with Norman nobles represented the most fundamental transformation wrought by the conquest. This created an entirely new social structure based on continental feudal principles that would reshape English society permanently. The Domesday Book reveals the staggering scope of this transformation. By 1086, only 2 major English landholders retained substantial estates, with virtually all significant properties having been granted to Norman, Breton, or Flemish nobles who owed military service to the king. Archaeological evidence from manor houses and estate centres shows rapid architectural changes as new lords constructed stone buildings reflecting continental styles, while English timber halls fell into disrepair or were deliberately demolished. The very landscape was being rewritten in Norman stone. The introduction of feudal land tenure transformed the relationship between lords and peasants, replacing the complex web of obligations and rights that had characterized Anglo-Saxon society with standardized continental practices. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals changes in agricultural practices and settlement patterns as Norman lords imposed new forms of estate management designed to maximize revenue extraction. The construction of watermills and expansion of arable cultivation at the expense of woodland and pasture reflected the commercial orientation that Norman landholders brought to English agriculture. Even farming was becoming Norman. The Domesday Book survey of 1086 represented the most comprehensive administrative undertaking in medieval Europe, documenting the kingdom's resources with unprecedented detail and accuracy. The survey's compilation required enormous logistical coordination, with royal commissioners travelling throughout England to record landholding, population, and economic resources at the manor level. Archaeological evidence from sites mentioned in Domesday reveals the remarkable accuracy of the survey's information. Excavations consistently confirm details about settlement sizes, agricultural resources, and economic activities recorded by Norman administrators with scientific precision. The survey's primary purpose involved establishing clear records of land tenure and tax obligations that would prevent disputes while maximizing royal revenue. Archaeological evidence from administrative centers like Winchester reveals the sophisticated record-keeping systems that supported Domesday's compilation, with evidence of scriptoria and administrative buildings where the survey's information was processed and recorded. The survival of the 2 volumes known as Great Domesday and Little Domesday demonstrates the permanent nature of Norman administrative innovations and their influence on subsequent governmental development. These weren't just tax records, they were the blueprints for a New England. The transformation of English ecclesiastical life under Norman rule involved the systematic replacement of English bishops and abbots with continental appointees who possessed both theological training and political loyalty to the new regime. Archaeological evidence from cathedral sites like Canterbury, Winchester, and York reveals rapid architectural changes that accompanied administrative transformation. Construction began almost immediately on new buildings reflecting continental Romanesque styles. These massive construction projects required enormous resources and demonstrated Norman determination to impose their cultural preferences on English ecclesiastical institutions, while showing their commitment to Reformed Christianity promoted by the papal reform movement. When Henry thus ascended to the throne in 1100 following his brother William Rufus's death in a hunting accident, he inherited a kingdom that had been completely transformed. The England that Alfred had saved, that Athelstan had unified, and that Edward the Confessor had ruled was gone forever, replaced by something that was recognizably Norman in every aspect, from law to language, architecture to administration. The Norman conquest had achieved what no previous invasion had accomplished: the complete cultural transformation of an entire civilization. Anglo-Saxon England hadn't just been conquered. It had been fundamentally reimagined according to continental European models that would influence English development for the next 1,000 years. The youngest son of William the Conqueror possessed something far more dangerous than military reputation or ruthless efficiency. He had political genius. Henry may have lacked his eldest brother Robert Curthow's warrior credentials or William II's brutal effectiveness, but his administrative innovations would establish governmental foundations that endured throughout the medieval period, transforming how kingdoms could be ruled. Archaeological evidence from Winchester, where Henry maintained his primary treasury, tells the story of this transformation. Extensive modifications to the royal palace complex included new stone buildings designed specifically to accommodate the expanded bureaucracy that characterized his revolutionary approach to kingship. The construction of specialized chambers for record-keeping and financial administration demonstrates the systematic thinking Henry brought to royal government. These weren't just buildings, they were the physical infrastructure of a new kind of medieval state that operated through documentation and procedure rather than personal relationships alone. But Henry's path to power was far from certain. The succession crisis that erupted immediately after his accession in 1100 reflected the complex inheritance arrangements established by William the Conqueror, creating a family conflict that would define Norman politics for decades. Robert Curthow's claim to England based on primogeniture conflicted directly with Henry's possession of the royal treasury and control of key administrative centres. Archaeological excavations at Portsmouth reveal evidence of the fortifications Henry frantically constructed to defend against his brother's expected invasion, earthwork defences and stone towers controlling access to the harbour where Robert's invasion fleet might land. The rapid construction of these defensive works demonstrates Henry's remarkable ability to mobilise resources and coordinate military preparations despite the questionable legitimacy of his rule. He was fighting for survival against his own family while simultaneously building the governmental machinery that would outlast them all. The Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 resolved the succession dispute through Henry's decisive victory over Robert's forces in Normandy. The engagement's location near the site of William the Conqueror's birth provided symbolic significance that Henry brilliantly exploited to legitimize his conquest of the duchy. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield area includes weapon fragments and horse equipment, confirming contemporary accounts of fierce cavalry fighting between Norman nobles supporting rival claimants. This wasn't just a family feud, but was a war that determined whether the Anglo-Norman realm would fragment or consolidate under unified rule. Henry's capture of Robert Curth has eliminated the primary threat to his authority, while establishing English control over Normandy that would persist for over a century. The victory demonstrated that administrative competence could triumph over military reputation when properly organized and financed. Henry's governmental innovations transformed royal administration from the personal household management that had characterized earlier Norman rule into something revolutionary: a sophisticated bureaucratic system capable of governing territories spanning from Scotland to the Loire Valley. The development of the Exchequer as a specialized financial court created permanent institutions for revenue collection and audit that operated independently of the king's personal presence. This was governmental genius, creating systems that functioned whether the king was in England, Normandy, or anywhere else in his expanding domains. Archaeological evidence from Westminster reveals the construction of specialized buildings designed specifically to accommodate the Exchequer's sessions. Stone chambers equipped with accounting tables and storage facilities necessary for complex financial calculations and record-keeping represent the physical infrastructure of medieval bureaucracy. The pipe rolls that survive from Henry's reign provide unprecedented insight into royal finances and administrative procedures. These annual records of sheriff's accounts document revenue collection from every English county, revealing the systematic precision of Norman fiscal administration that operated like clockwork across the entire kingdom. Archaeological evidence from shire towns like Oxford and Northampton shows the construction of specialized buildings designed to accommodate royal officials during their periodic visits for account, auditing and judicial proceedings. The standardization of weights, measures, and accounting procedures across Henry's territories demonstrates bureaucratic sophistication that distinguished his government from earlier medieval administrations. Henry's legal innovations established precedents that would influence English law for centuries. The creation of royal courts with standardized procedures provided alternatives to local courts dominated by baronial interests, while the development of writs as formal legal instruments created systematic methods for initiating legal proceedings. Archaeological evidence from sites like Clarendon reveals the construction of royal hunting lodges that also served as judicial centres where Henry held court sessions during his frequent travels throughout the kingdom. These buildings combined residential accommodation with formal halls designed for legal proceedings and administrative meetings, demonstrating how Henry integrated governance with royal lifestyle. Then catastrophe struck with devastating suddenness. The White Ship disaster of November 25, 1120, fundamentally altered the trajectory of English royal succession and created the crisis that would dominate the remainder of Henry's reign. The vessels sinking in the English Channel while carrying the king's heir, William Etheling, and numerous young nobles returning from Normandy eliminated an entire generation of royal and aristocratic leadership in a single night. Archaeological investigation of medieval shipwrecks from this period reveals the construction techniques and navigational equipment used by cross-channel vessels, overlapping planks, secured by iron fastenings and ballast stones providing stability in rough seas. The White Ship's loss during what contemporary sources describe as calm weather suggests either structural failure or navigational error that proved catastrophic for English political stability. One moment of maritime disaster threatened to undo decades of careful governmental construction. Henry's response to his son's death involved desperate attempts to secure the succession through remarriage and the unprecedented designation of his daughter Matilda as heir. The king's marriage to Adeliza of Louvain in 1121 represented a calculated effort to produce male heirs, while Matilda's recall from Germany, following her husband Emperor Henry V's death in 1125, demonstrated Henry's determination to maintain direct dynastic control. Archaeological evidence from royal residences shows extensive modifications undertaken during this period to accommodate the expanded court necessary for training Matilda in governmental procedures and establishing her legitimacy as future ruler. Henry was essentially creating the infrastructure for female rule in a world that had never accepted such a concept. The oath-taking ceremony of 1127, where Henry compelled his barons to swear allegiance to Matilda as his heir, represented an unprecedented departure from traditional succession practices. Contemporary sources describe the reluctance with which nobles accepted female rule, particularly given Matilda's imperious personality and her subsequent marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, which created the possibility of Angevin control over England. Archaeological evidence from sites like Woodstock, where the ceremony took place, reveals the substantial royal complex that provided appropriate settings for such momentous political events. Great halls capable of accommodating the assembled nobility and their retinues created the stage for Henry's desperate attempt to secure his dynasty's future. Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet in 1128 created the dynastic alliance that would transform medieval European politics while generating immediate opposition from Norman barons who feared Angevin domination. Geoffrey's nickname derived from the broom flower he wore as a personal emblem, though the family would become known to history as the Angevins or Plantagenets. Archaeological excavations at Angers reveal the sophisticated castle complex that served as the centre of Angevin power, massive stone keeps and defensive walls demonstrating the military capabilities. Geoffrey brought to his marriage alliance the castle's strategic position controlling the Loire Valley, provided the territorial base from which the Angevins would eventually dominate western France. But Henry's careful planning would crumble almost immediately after his death. Stephen of Blois' seizure of the English throne following Henry's death, in December 1135, initiated the civil war known as the Anarchy, a conflict that would devastate England for nearly 2 decades and demonstrate that even the most sophisticated governmental systems meant nothing without legitimate succession. The stage was set for a war between two competing visions of medieval kingship: Stephen's traditional male rule backed by Norman barons, and Matilda's unprecedented female rule supported by Angevin military power. The outcome would determine not just who ruled England, but what kind of kingdom England would become in the transformative 12th century. Stephen's lightning seizure of the English throne was a masterpiece of political opportunism that would trigger 2 decades of devastating civil war. His claim derived from his position as Henry's favourite nephew and his crucial presence in England when the king died, allowing him to secure the royal treasury at Winchester and obtain coronation at Westminster before potential rivals could organise opposition. This wasn't legitimate succession, no. It was a calculated power grab executed with ruthless efficiency. Archaeological evidence from London reveals the frantic fortification of the Tower undertaken during Stephen's early reign, with new defensive walls and residential buildings providing secure accommodation for the royal court during periods of political uncertainty. Stephen knew his rule was illegitimate and prepared accordingly. When Matilda invaded England in 1139, she unleashed unprecedented destruction across the kingdom as rival claimants competed for territorial control. Contemporary sources described the complete breakdown of royal authority that allowed local strongmen to construct unauthorized castles and prey upon civilian populations without legal restraint. Archaeological survey work has identified over 500 castle sites, dating to this period, money representing temporary fortifications built by minor nobles seeking to establish independent authority during the collapse of central government. These adultering castles typically consisted of simple motte and bailey constructions that could be erected quickly using local labour and materials. The kingdom was fragmenting into dozens of petty lordships ruled by warlords who recognized no authority beyond their own military power. This was medieval England's descent into chaos, where strength mattered more than law and violence replaced governmental procedure. The siege warfare that characterized the Civil War demonstrated both the effectiveness of castle fortifications and the brutal limitations of medieval military technology. Archaeological excavations at sites like Wallingford and Oxford reveal evidence of prolonged sieges that determined control of strategic locations. The siege lines, temporary fortifications, and systematic destruction that accompanied these desperate operations. The siege of Oxford Castle in 1142, where Matilda escaped across frozen ground during a winter night, perfectly illustrates the dramatic reversals of fortune that characterize this period of political instability. Today's victor could become tomorrow's fugitive, fleeing through frozen fields while enemies controlled the halls where she had recently held court. The economic devastation caused by prolonged warfare appears with heartbreaking clarity in archaeological evidence from rural settlements across England. Sites like Warren Percy in Yorkshire show evidence of abandonment and destruction during the 1140s, burned buildings and scattered metal objects, suggesting hasty evacuation by civilian populations caught in the crossfire of aristocratic ambition. The breakdown of royal authority allowed local strongmen to extract tribute from surrounding territories while engaging in private warfare that disrupted agricultural production and trade networks. The economic prosperity that had characterized Henry I's reign evaporated as warfare consumed resources and terrorized populations. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 finally resolved the succession crisis through a compromise that demonstrated exhaustion rather than victory. The agreement recognized Stephen as king for his lifetime, while designating Matilda's son Henry as heir nullius, a solution that satisfied neither side completely but ended the devastation that was destroying England. Archaeological evidence from Wallingford reveals the substantial earthwork fortifications that made the site strategically crucial during the Civil War. Multiple defensive lines and evidence of siege operations demonstrate the location's military importance, while the treaty negotiations took place literally in the shadow of these fortifications. The visible reminder of warfare's costs provided powerful incentive for both parties to reach accommodation. Henry Six's in 1154 at age 21 brought to the English throne one of medieval Europe's most capable rulers, whose territories would eventually span from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains. This wasn't just the restoration of royal authority, was the creation of a continental empire that would dominate Western European politics for the next century. The young king inherited England and Normandy from his maternal grandfather Henry I, but also Anjou, Maine and Touraine from his father Geoffrey Plantagenet. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 had added her vast duchies in southwestern France, creating the Angevin Empire that made the English king more powerful than the French king himself. Archaeological evidence from Chinon, one of Henry's favourite residences, reveals the sophisticated castle complex that served as an administrative centre for these scattered territories. Residential quarters, administrative buildings, and defensive works accommodated the peripatetic court necessary for governing such extensive domains through constant royal travel. The administrative systems Henry developed to govern his empire represented the most sophisticated governmental machinery in medieval Europe. The creation of specialized departments for different aspects of royal administration allowed for systematic record-keeping and policy implementation across territories with diverse legal traditions and administrative practices. Archaeological evidence from Westminster reveals the construction of new government buildings designed specifically to accommodate the expanded bureaucracy, specialized chambers for different administrative functions, and secure storage for the growing archive of governmental records, demonstrate the institutional sophistication that characterized Angevin government. The development of common law under Henry II created unified legal procedures that gradually replaced the patchwork of local customs and baronial privileges that had characterized earlier legal systems. The king's decision to send royal justices on regular circuits throughout England established consistent legal standards while extending royal authority into previously autonomous local jurisdictions. Archaeological evidence from shire towns shows the construction of specialized buildings designed to accommodate these judicial sessions, more formal courtrooms, and secure facilities for holding prisoners awaiting trial. The infrastructure of royal justice was literally being built in stone across the kingdom. The Constitutions of Clarendon, issued in 1164, represented Henry's ambitious attempt to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority in systematic legal terms. The document's 16 clauses addressed issues ranging from clerical taxation to criminal jurisdiction over clergy members, reflecting the king's determination to assert royal authority over every aspect of English society. Archaeological excavations at Clarendon Palace reveal the substantial royal complex, where these constitutions were promulgated, diorite halls and residential buildings that provided appropriate settings for the formal ceremonies accompanying major legislative pronouncements. These weren't just legal documents, they were revolutionary attempts to define the limits of royal and ecclesiastical power. But Henry's greatest challenge would come from an unexpected source, his own former chancellor. The conflict with Thomas Becket emerged from Henry's appointment of his chancellor as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, expecting continued cooperation from his former administrative subordinate. Becket's dramatic transformation from royal servant to defender of ecclesiastical privileges reflected a spiritual conversion that accompanied his elevation to England's premier ecclesiastical office. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury Cathedral reveals the substantial rebuilding program undertaken during Becket's archepiscopate, with new construction reflecting reformed liturgical practices and architectural styles that emphasized ecclesiastical independence from secular authority. The escalating dispute between Henry and Becket centered on fundamental questions about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that had divided medieval Europe since the investiture controversy. Becket's resistance to royal attempts to try criminal clergy in secular courts reflected broader ecclesiastical claims to independence from lay interference in church affairs. Archaeological evidence from sites like Northampton, where Becket was tried before a royal court in 1164, reveals the formal settings where these constitutional conflicts played out. Great halls designed to accommodate the elaborate ceremonial that surrounded medieval legal proceedings became battlegrounds for competing visions of royal and ecclesiastical authority. Becket's exile in France from 1164 to 1170 created an international crisis that involved the Pope, the French king, and other European rulers in English ecclesiastical affairs. The Archbishop's residence at Pontigny Abbey provided him with a secure base for organizing opposition to Henry's ecclesiastical policies, while maintaining communication with supporters in England. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the relationship between church and state for centuries to come, as two former friends and collaborators found themselves locked in a struggle that could only end in triumph or tragedy. Archaeological excavations at Pontigny tell a remarkable story of medieval exile that transcends simple political refuge. The monastic complex that sheltered Becket during his banishment reveals evidence of the international pilgrimage that developed around the exiled archbishop, even before his eventual martyrdom. Pilgrims were already treating Becket as a living saint, traveling across Europe to seek his blessing while he remained in forced exile from his own cathedral. The reconciliation between Henry and Becket in 1170 proved to be nothing more than political theatre, temporary and superficial diplomacy that failed completely to resolve the fundamental disagreements that had caused their original conflict. Both men were too proud, too convinced of their righteousness, to make the compromises necessary for genuine peace. Becket's return to Canterbury in December 1170 was marked immediately by his excommunication of bishops who had participated in the coronation of Henry's eldest son, demonstrating his continued defiant resistance to royal authority. The archbishop hadn't learned humility during his exile. If anything, his years away had hardened his determination to assert ecclesiastical independence. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury reveals extensive preparations for Becket's return, with modifications to the cathedral and archiepiscopal palace that reflected his absolute determination to assert ecclesiastical supremacy. These weren't just building repairs, they were architectural statements of ecclesiastical independence, designed to demonstrate that Canterbury would bow to no earthly authority. Then came the event that would define medieval church-state relations forever. The murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, shocked medieval Europe and created one of the most powerful martyrdom cults in Christian history. The four knights who killed the Archbishop Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton acted on their interpretation of Henry's angry words about his troublesome priest, though the king consistently denied ordering Becket's assassination. Archaeological investigation of Canterbury Cathedral has identified the probable location of Becket's murder near the altar of St. Benedict, with evidence of immediate modifications made to accommodate the shrine that was established at the martyrdom site. The immediate aftermath of Becket's murder witnessed something extraordinary, the rapid development of miracle stories and pilgrimage that transformed Canterbury into one of Europe's most important religious centres almost overnight. Contemporary accounts describe miraculous healings associated with Becket's blood and personal possessions, while the cathedral's monks systematically recorded these miracles to support their campaign for the archbishop's canonization. Archaeological evidence reveals the rapid development of infrastructure to accommodate this flood of pilgrims, new hostels, roads, and commercial establishments that supported the religious tourism that became absolutely central to Canterbury's economy. Becket's death had created not just a martyr, but an entire industry built around his cult. Henry's penance at Becket's tomb in 1174 represented one of medieval Europe's most dramatic displays of royal humility, with the king submitting to ritual scourging by Canterbury's monks while dressed in penitential garments. This wasn't just religious symbolism, this was political theatre of the highest order. The ceremony's political significance extended far beyond religious demonstration, showing Henry's recognition that Becket's martyrdom had fundamentally altered the balance between royal and ecclesiastical authority forever. A king was literally begging forgiveness from a dead archbishop's monks. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury Cathedral shows the elaborate shrine constructed to house Becket's remains, with gold and silver decorations that reflected the enormous wealth generated by pilgrimage to the martyrdom site. The murdered archbishop had become more powerful in death than he had ever been in life. But Henry's troubles were far from over. The rebellion of 1173 to 1174, led by Henry's own eldest son and supported by Eleanor of Aquitaine, represented the most serious threat to Angevin authority during Henry's entire reign. The revolt's timing, coinciding with Henry's conflict with Becket's supporters and external pressure from the French king, created a perfect storm that threatened to fragment the entire empire. Archaeological evidence from sites like Framlingham Castle in Suffolk reveals the substantial fortifications constructed by rebellious barons, massive stone defences that provided secure bases for operations against royal forces. The kingdom Henry had worked decades to consolidate, was fracturing under the pressure of family betrayal and ecclesiastical opposition. The Siege of Rouen in 1174 demonstrated Henry's remarkable military capabilities and his absolute determination to maintain control over his continental territories. The city's strategic importance as Normandy's capital made its defence crucial for Angevin authority, while its fall would have provided the French king with a foothold for further expansion into Norman territories. Archaeological excavations at Rouen reveal evidence of desperate siege operations, temporary fortifications and systematic destruction that accompanied the military operations necessary to maintain the city's loyalty to Henry. The Angevin Empire was being held together through sheer force of will and military precision. Richard the Lionheart's accession in 1189 brought to the throne a king whose primary interests lay in crusading and continental warfare rather than English governmental administration. The new king viewed England as a treasure chest to fund his military adventures rather than a kingdom to govern with care. Richard's immediate preparations for the Third Crusade required unprecedented financial resources that strained the administrative system his father had carefully developed. Archaeological evidence from the Tower of London reveals modifications undertaken to secure the enormous treasure accumulated for his crusading expedition. Strengthened walls and new storage facilities designed to protect the wealth systematically extracted from English resources. The Third Crusade represented the largest military expedition undertaken by medieval England, requiring logistical coordination that demonstrated the administrative sophistication achieved under Angevin rule. Richard's fleet, assembled at Portsmouth and other English ports, included vessels capable of transporting not only troops but also horses, siege equipment, and supplies necessary for extended campaigning in the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological investigation of medieval shipyards reveals the construction techniques used for these specialized transport vessels, reinforced hulls, and expanded cargo capacity that reflected the unique requirements of crusading warfare. England had become the logistical base for continental military ambitions. Richard's campaigns in the Holy Land established his reputation as one of medieval Europe's greatest military commanders, while demonstrating the brutal limitations of crusading warfare against sophisticated Muslim opponents. The Siege of Acre, where Richard's forces played a crucial role in the city's capture, revealed both the effectiveness of Western military technology and the resilience of Islamic defensive strategies. Archaeological excavations at Acre have uncovered evidence of the siege operations, massive stone projectiles, and systematic destruction that accompanied the city's eventual fall to crusading forces. The Third Crusade had become a technological arms race between Christian and Islamic military engineering, but disaster struck during Richard's return journey. The king's capture by Leopold of Austria created a succession crisis that tested the stability of Angevin governmental institutions to their breaking point. Richard's imprisonment in Germany from 1192 to 1194 required payment of an enormous ransom that strained English resources, while creating opportunities for his brother John to attempt usurpation. Archaeological evidence from Nottingham Castle reveals the fortifications John constructed during his brother's absence, new defensive works that provided secure bases for his attempted seizure of royal authority. The Angevin Empire was fracturing under the pressure of an absent king and ambitious relatives. Eleanor of Aquitaine's role in securing Richard's release demonstrated the continued crucial importance of royal women in medieval politics. Despite their formal exclusion from governmental authority, the Queen Mother's negotiations with Emperor Henry VI required diplomatic skills and financial resources that reflected her decades of hard-won experience in European politics. Archaeological evidence from Winchester reveals the expanded administrative infrastructure that supported Eleanor's efforts. New facilities for record-keeping and financial administration that coordinated the ransom collection across Richard's scattered territories. A woman in her 70s was holding together an empire that her warrior son had abandoned for crusading glory. John's accession in 1199, following Richard's death at the Siege of Challis, created immediate challenges from his nephew Arthur of Brittany, whose supporters argued for his superior claim based on primogeniture. The dispute reflected the uncertain nature of Angevin succession practices and the complex inheritance arrangements that governed medieval royal families. Archaeological evidence from sites like Rumen reveals the competing fortifications both claimants constructed during their struggle for control, defensive works that literally divided Norman loyalties between rival members of the same royal family. The Great Angevin Experiment was entering its final crisis. The empire that Henry II had built through administrative genius, that Richard had funded through English wealth, would soon face its ultimate test under John's troubled rule. The kingdom that had survived Roman withdrawal, Saxon settlement, Viking conquest, and Norman domination was about to confront challenges that would reshape England's relationship with continental Europe forever. The story that began with Rome's abandonment of Britain in 410 had reached its medieval climax, an English king ruling territories from Scotland to the Pyrenees, commanding resources that rivaled any power in Europe, yet facing internal rebellion and external pressure that threatened to destroy everything his predecessors had built. The transformation was complete. Roman Britain had become Anglo-Saxon England, which had become Norman England, which had evolved into the heart of a continental empire. But empires, like civilizations, rise and fall according to forces larger than any individual ruler can control. The next chapter would determine whether the Angevin achievement would endure or fragment, like so many ambitious medieval projects before it. The year 1204 brought catastrophe that would haunt English kings for centuries. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus of France represented the most devastating territorial defeat suffered by English monarchs since the Norman conquest itself. John's complete inability to defend his continental inheritance reflected not just military incompetence, but the financial exhaustion that resulted from decades of relentless warfare and Richard's ruinously expensive crusading adventures. Archaeological evidence from Norman castles like Chateau Gaillard tells the story of this disaster with heartbreaking clarity. Richard Dad had constructed these sophisticated defensive works to protect the duchy, with concentric fortifications and revolutionary architectural innovations that should have been impregnable. Yet they proved completely insufficient against sustained French pressure combined with John's catastrophic military leadership. The castle's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was the symbolic end of the cross-channel empire that had defined English royal authority for over a century. The Angevin domains that had stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees were fragmenting, leaving English kings as mere island rulers rather than continental powers. But territorial disaster was only the beginning of John's problems. The interdict imposed by Pope Innocent III from 1208 to 1213 created an unprecedented religious and political crisis that plunged medieval England into spiritual darkness. The papal prohibition on religious services, except for baptisms and last rites, effectively placed the entire kingdom under spiritual quarantine, while John's excommunication in 1209 released his subjects from their sacred oaths of allegiance. Archaeological evidence from parish churches across England reveals the devastating impact of this spiritual blockade. Abandoned religious buildings and disrupted ecclesiastical activities affected every aspect of medieval social life. Churches fell silent, bells stopped ringing, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. For a deeply Christian society, this was psychological warfare of unprecedented brutality. John's eventual submission to papal authority in 1213 represented one of history's most dramatic political reversals, transforming England into a papal fief, while providing the king with powerful ecclesiastical support against domestic opposition. The ceremony at Dover, where John surrendered his crown to papal legate Pandulf before receiving it back as a papal vassal, marked one of the most humiliating moments in medieval English political history. Archaeological evidence from Dover Castle reveals the substantial royal complex where this submission took place, Bocrate halls and ceremonial chambers that provided appropriate settings for such momentous political theatre. A king was literally kneeling before a foreign priest, surrendering his crown to save his throne. The baronial opposition that culminated in Magna Carta reflected fundamental disagreements about the limits of royal authority that had been building throughout John's disastrous reign. The barons' grievances centered on John's arbitrary taxation, his systematic abuse of feudal obligations, and his complete violation of traditional legal procedures that had previously provided protection against royal tyranny. Archaeological evidence from Runnymede reveals the meadow setting where the final negotiations took place. Iseo evidence of temporary structures erected to accommodate the assembled nobility and their retinues during the extended discussions that produced history's most famous constitutional document. Magna Carta's 63 clauses address specific abuses while establishing general principles that would influence constitutional development for centuries to come. The Charter's provisions regarding taxation, legal procedures, and individual rights reflected the barons' absolute determination to constrain royal authority within legal frameworks that protected traditional privileges and established the revolutionary principle that even kings must obey the law. Archaeological evidence from scriptoria at St. Albans reveals the monastic workshops where copies of the Charter were frantically produced for distribution throughout the kingdom. Specialized materials and scribal techniques created these crucial constitutional documents that would outlive everyone who signed them. But the constitutional settlement proved tragically fragile. The First Barons' War that erupted following John's immediate repudiation of Magna Carta demonstrated the persistence of fundamental disagreements about royal authority and the king's complete inability to honor any agreement that limited his power. The barons' desperate invitation to Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne created the terrifying possibility of Capetian conquest that threatened to reverse the Norman conquest's entire legacy. Archaeological evidence from siege sites like Rochester Castle reveals the devastating intensity of warfare that accompanied this constitutional crisis, with systematic destruction and sophisticated siege techniques employed by both royal and baronial forces. England was literally tearing itself apart in civil war, while foreign armies prepared to complete the conquest that political chaos had made possible. The kingdom that had survived Roman withdrawal, Saxon settlement, Viking invasion, and Norman conquest was facing its greatest existential crisis yet. Then on October 19th, 1216, everything changed. John's sudden death at Newark during the height of the First Barons' War created an unexpected opportunity for constitutional settlement that would fundamentally reshape English royal authority forever. The 9-year-old Henry III's accession, under the regency of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, transformed the political landscape overnight by removing the personal animosity that had driven baronial opposition to John's tyrannical rule. Archaeological evidence from Gloucester Cathedral, where Henry's hasty coronation took place, reveals the modest scale of the ceremony compared to previous royal inaugurations. Temporary arrangements necessitated by civil war and the absence of traditional regalia captured by rebel forces tell the story of a monarchy in crisis. The young king's coronation using his mother's gold circlet rather than the crown jewels symbolized both the monarchy's reduced circumstances and the pragmatic adaptations required during political emergency. William Marshal's appointment as regent reflected the barons' recognition that only a figure of unquestioned honor and military capability could navigate the complex challenges facing the kingdom. At over 70 years old, Marshal brought decades of experience serving 4 previous kings, along with a reputation for chivalric conduct that transcended factional divisions. Archaeological excavations at his estate at Caversham reveal the substantial stone buildings and defensive works that had supported his regional authority, while documentary evidence shows his methodical approach to rebuilding royal administration through careful personnel selection and systematic restoration of governmental procedures. The reissue of Magna Carta in November 1216, modified to remove the most objectionable clauses while retaining core protections against royal abuse, demonstrated the new government's commitment to constitutional rule. The revised charter eliminated provisions for baronial oversight of royal actions, while maintaining fundamental legal protections and limitations on arbitrary taxation. Archaeological evidence from scriptoria at St. Albans and other monastic centres reveals the rapid production of copies for distribution throughout England, with standardized parchment preparation and scribal techniques ensuring accurate transmission of the constitutional text. The Great Charter was becoming the foundation of English law. The Siege of Lincoln in May 1217 marked the decisive turning point in the Civil War, with Marshal's brilliant victory over the combined forces of rebellious barons and French troops, effectively ending organized resistance to Henry's rule. The battle demonstrated Marshal's continued military effectiveness despite his advanced age, with tactical innovations that exploited urban terrain to neutralize French cavalry advantages. Archaeological investigation of Lincoln's medieval defenses reveals evidence of desperate siege operations, temporary fortifications erected by both attackers and defenders, scattered weapons and equipment, confirming contemporary accounts of fierce fighting in the city's narrow streets. Medieval England's greatest knight was winning his final battle. The naval Battle of Sandwich in August 1217 eliminated the French threat permanently by destroying the supply fleet that sustained Prince Louis's forces in England. Hubert de Burgh's command of the English fleet demonstrated the maritime capabilities that had developed during the Angevin period, with specialized warships equipped for ramming and boarding actions against enemy vessels. Archaeological investigation of medieval harbors reveals the sophisticated infrastructure necessary for maintaining naval forces, shipyards, rope walks, and storage facilities for naval stores that supported extended maritime operations. England was becoming a naval power capable of defending its island independence. The story that began with Roman withdrawal in 410 had reached its constitutional climax. Through 6 centuries of invasion, conquest, and transformation, England had evolved from a collection of Romano-British civitates to a unified kingdom governed by law rather than arbitrary royal will. Magna Carta represented more than a constitutional document. It embodied the principle that legitimate authority derived from law rather than force, that even kings must submit to legal constraints, and that subjects possessed rights that government must respect. These revolutionary concepts, born from medieval baronial resistance to royal tyranny, would echo through centuries of constitutional development and ultimately influence democratic movements across the globe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's final entries could never have imagined this outcome when they recorded the simple statement that William came to this land and won it. From the wreckage of conquest had emerged something unprecedented: a constitutional monarchy bound by law, accountable to subjects, and committed to principles that would define English political development for the next 800 years. The transformation was complete. Roman Britain had become Anglo-Saxon England, which became Norman England, which evolved into the Angevin Empire, which finally matured into a constitutional kingdom where law ruled supreme. The greatest achievement of medieval England wasn't territorial conquest or military victory. It was the creation of governmental institutions that recognized the dignity of subjects and the limits of royal authority. The Treaty of Lambeth in September 1217 didn't just end French intervention in English affairs, it established diplomatic precedents that would influence conflict resolution for centuries to come. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterclass in practical diplomacy that demonstrated how skilled negotiation could achieve what warfare alone couldn't accomplish. Prince Louis's renunciation of his claim to the English throne in exchange for financial compensation and safe passage for his supporters revealed the pragmatic brilliance that characterized William Marshall's regency. Rather than pursue costly military campaigns to eliminate every last threat, Marshall understood that money could buy peace more efficiently than blood could win it. Archaeological evidence from Lambeth Palace tells the story of these crucial negotiations. The ecclesiastical setting provided great halls and residential buildings that offered appropriate accommodation for the diplomatic meetings that finally resolved England's devastating constitutional crisis. These weren't just political discussions, they were the foundations of a new approach to international relations based on negotiation rather than conquest. The minority government's administrative innovations established governmental foundations that would endure throughout Henry's extraordinarily long reign. The development of specialized departments for different aspects of royal administration created something revolutionary: institutional continuity that operated independently of individual personalities or political circumstances. Archaeological evidence from Westminster reveals the construction of new administrative buildings designed specifically to accommodate this expanded bureaucracy. Specialized chambers for record-keeping, financial administration, and judicial proceedings reflected the growing sophistication of royal government that was becoming a permanent institution rather than the king's personal household. The systematic restoration of royal castles damaged during the Civil War demonstrated the methodical approach that characterized every aspect of the minority government's policies. Sites like Rochester, Kenilworth, and Dover received substantial investment in defensive improvements and residential accommodation that restored their effectiveness as centers of royal authority. Archaeological excavations reveal evidence of the advanced construction techniques employed during this restoration program. Improved masonry work and innovative architectural features incorporated crucial lessons learned from recent siege warfare, creating fortifications that could withstand the latest military technology while providing comfortable accommodation for royal administration. But this golden age of effective government couldn't last forever. Henry's assumption of personal rule in 1227 marked the beginning of a new and troubling phase in English royal administration. The young king's inexperience and dangerous reliance on foreign advisors created immediate tensions with English barons who had expected greater influence in governmental affairs after their sacrifices during the Civil War. The dismissal of Hubert de Burgh in 1232 eliminated the last crucial connection to the successful minority government, while opening positions of authority to Pitaven and Provençal favourites, who completely lacked understanding of English political traditions. Archaeological evidence from royal residences shows extensive modifications undertaken to accommodate these foreign courtiers, new residential buildings, and ceremonial spaces that reflected continental architectural preferences rather than English governmental needs. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 strengthened these problematic continental connections while introducing additional foreign influences that further complicated English political relationships. Eleanor's relatives, particularly her uncles Peter of Aigueblanche and Boniface of Savoy, received substantial English benefices and governmental positions that generated massive resentment among English nobles, systematically excluded from royal favour. Archaeological evidence from episcopal palaces reveals the staggering building programs undertaken by these foreign ecclesiastics. Construction projects demonstrated their enormous wealth and political influence, while highlighting the vast resources diverted from traditional English recipients of royal patronage. English nobles watched foreigners grow rich from English resources, while they themselves were marginalized in their own kingdom. The failed expedition to Poitou in 1242 represented Henry's most serious and disastrous attempt to recover the continental territories lost by his father. Military incompetence combined with completely inadequate financial resources doomed the campaign to humiliating failure from the start. The king's complete inability to coordinate effectively with local allies or adapt to changing military conditions in France demonstrated the catastrophic limitations of English military capabilities. After decades of civil war and administrative neglect, archaeological evidence from French castle sites reveals the sophisticated defensive works that English forces encountered, concentric fortifications, and innovative architectural features reflecting crucial advances in military engineering during the intervening decades. The financial crisis that followed the Pontafin expedition's failure created unprecedented tensions between the crown and its subjects over taxation and governmental expenditure. Henry's desperate requests for extraordinary taxation to fund further continental adventures met increasing resistance from barons, who questioned both the campaign's feasibility and their benefit to English interests. Archaeological evidence from shire towns reveals the expanding administrative infrastructure necessary for tax collection, specialized buildings, and record-keeping systems that documented the growing burden placed on English resources to fund royal ambitions that served no English interests whatsoever. The Sicilian affair, beginning in 1254, when Henry accepted the papal offer of the Sicilian crown for his second son, Edmund, created financial obligations that completely exceeded the kingdom's resources while generating fierce opposition to papal taxation. The Pope's demands for substantial payments to support military campaigns against the Hohenstaufen dynasty in southern Italy conflicted directly with English political traditions requiring consent for extraordinary taxation. Archaeological evidence from ecclesiastical sites reveals the devastating impact of papal taxation on English religious institutions. Evidence of financial strain and reduced building activity reflected the massive diversion of resources to support papal political objectives that had nothing to do with English interests. Into this crisis stepped one of medieval England's most remarkable figures, Simon de Montfort's emergence as leader of baronial opposition to Henry's catastrophic policies reflected both personal grievances and broader constitutional concerns about royal authority and governmental accountability. His marriage to the king's sister Eleanor in 1238 had initially brought him into the royal circle, but subsequent disputes over financial arrangements and political influence transformed him into the most dangerous critic of royal policies. Archaeological evidence from his estates at Kenilworth reveals the substantial castle complex that provided the military base for his political activities, innovative defensive features and residential accommodation reflecting his status as one of England's most powerful magnates. The Provisions of Oxford in 1258 represented the most systematic and revolutionary attempt to reform royal government since Magna Carta, establishing baronial oversight of royal administration while addressing specific grievances about taxation, foreign influences, and judicial procedures that had accumulated over decades of royal misrule. The document's detailed provisions for governmental reform reflected careful planning by baronial leaders who possessed both theoretical understanding of constitutional principles and practical experience in administrative affairs. This wasn't just aristocratic rebellion. It was sophisticated constitutional engineering designed to preserve royal authority while constraining royal abuse. Archaeological evidence from Oxford reveals the university setting where these momentous negotiations took place, with evidence of the intellectual ferment that contributed to constitutional innovation during this transformative period. The medieval university was becoming a center for political thought that would influence governmental development for centuries. The establishment of the Council of 15 under the Provisions created unprecedented limitations on royal authority, while providing practical mechanisms for baronial participation in governmental decision-making. The council's composition, including representatives of different baronial factions along with royal nominees, reflected sophisticated attempts to balance competing interests while ensuring effective governmental operation. Archaeological evidence from council meeting sites reveals the formal settings where these constitutional innovations were implemented, such as great halls and ceremonial chambers, providing appropriate venues for the elaborate procedures established by the Provisions. Medieval England was creating the infrastructure for constitutional government. The Provisions of Westminster in 1259 extended constitutional reform to local government and judicial administration, addressing long-standing grievances about sheriff's conduct, court procedures, and the relationship between royal and local authority. These provisions reflected broader concerns about governmental accountability and protection of individual rights that had developed during decades of administrative expansion and political conflict. England was witnessing the birth of constitutional government that would influence political development across the globe. From the ashes of royal misrule was emerging a new vision of limited monarchy, accountable administration, and protected rights that would define democratic ideals for centuries to come. The story that began with Roman withdrawal had reached its constitutional culmination. Through 8 centuries of invasion, conquest, and political evolution, England had created something unprecedented in medieval Europe: a governmental system based on law rather than arbitrary authority, consent rather than coercion, and constitutional principle rather than royal will. Archaeological evidence from shire courts and local administrative centres tells a remarkable story of constitutional revolution in action. The impact of the Provisions of Oxford on governmental practice appears in modifications to buildings and procedures that accommodated entirely new oversight mechanisms and appeal processes. Medieval England was literally rebuilding itself to accommodate constitutional government. But this revolutionary experiment wouldn't survive royal resistance. Henry's repudiation of the Provisions in 1261, supported by papal absolution from his oath to observe constitutional limitations, initiated the political crisis that would inevitably culminate in devastating civil war. The king's desperate appeal to Louis IX of France for arbitration reflected his determination to restore full royal authority while maintaining the appearance of legitimate action rather than arbitrary tyranny. Archaeological evidence from royal castles reveals extensive military preparations undertaken during this ominous period, improvements to defensive works, and systematic accumulation of military supplies demonstrated both sides' grim recognition that constitutional conflict would require military resolution. The Miss of Amiens in January 1264, where Louis IX completely invalidated the provisions of Oxford while upholding absolute royal authority, eliminated any remaining hopes for peaceful constitutional settlement and made armed conflict absolutely inevitable. The French king's decision reflected both his commitment to royal prerogatives and his deep concern about the dangerous precedent that successful baronial resistance might establish for his own kingdom. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Channel coast reveals the frantic military preparations undertaken by both sides, fortification improvements, and massive supply accumulations demonstrated the terrifying scale of the impending conflict that would determine England's constitutional future. The outbreak of the Second Barons' War in April 1264 represented a fundamental conflict between completely incompatible visions of English government. Royalists defended traditional royal